We will jump into the second group of questions related to the structure of the standard. And some elements were already discussed in our first session of discussions earlier this morning, but still there are some points in here which definitely need more of our attention. So I'll just again go through the questions for that section and also give you, well, you read the survey report, but just to give you back what were the overwhelming responses, answers that were given to each question. So the first one regarding the structure of the standard. RAD is organized into a general chapter and separate media-based chapters. Should the standard continue this structure? And we give an example about IZG, the way RAD2 was made, and DAX, which organized, where they organized the standard by area of description and element. And the answers were, well, most of the individuals, 51%, said no, organized by area of description and elements such as IZG. The second question in that group was, RAD groups elements into areas of description inherited from the bibliographic standards for describing publications, AACR2 and ISBD. Should the standard continue this form of organization? And we mentioned that, for example, IZG introduced new logical groupings of elements as areas of description, identity, context, content, etc. And in that case, also the majority of respondents, well, 43% said discontinue current approach, but not suggesting any alternative model. And 31% said follow IZG approach of grouping based on nature of archives. The following question was, RAD style of writing and numbering conventions are derived from AACR2. Are there better models? For example, IZG provides standardized data for each element. So each element has a numbering system, so a number, the name, the purpose, the rule itself, and then examples. So do we want to go with that? And 35% of people said follow IZG model, and 15% said discontinue current approach, but no specific model given. Following question, RAD includes prescribed punctuation rules. We referred to that a bit earlier. Some like it, some don't. Are these still necessary? I don't know if you want to go back on that subject, but that was one of the questions. And 60% of people surveyed say eliminate punctuation rules. 21% wanted to keep them. And does RAD need a data model to underpin the standard? This could identify the entities involved in description, their attributes, and their relationships. The data modeling approach was the basis for the thorough overhaul of the library's cataloging standard, RDA. And we mentioned that the ICA is currently undertaking the development of a conceptual model for archival description, which we also talked about. So do we need a data model? 45% of people surveyed said yes. 10% said yes, but coordinate with or participate in ICA work, in EGAD, I assume. And these were the questions. So, anyone want to start on that section regarding structure of the standard?
I think that's where we were headed, I think, towards the end of our last session, more away from a data content standard almost to a data structure standard and data modeling. I'm thinking, in part, picking up on some of the discussion earlier about the significance of context. and having a data model which would accompany the standard would help us to not only enforce some of those content elements dealing with some of the issues around inheritance, as well as allow us opportunities to provide hooks for additional standards. I was on the CCA Standards Committee, and I would say in response to your comment, Heather, that we endeavored to endorse. It was the database was intended and still is in its dormant form to provide a clearinghouse for standards which have been developed to deal with particular needs of institutions, and developing a data model that would allow us to hook those standards in to solve particular institutional needs would probably be a helpful addition to the standard.
The comment that I wanted to make with respect to the answers that were received with restructure, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea of going to the description of the elements themselves, but I think that would do a huge disservice to the majority of small and medium-sized archives across this country that rely on the current structure to give them guidance in what they do. And I think that it would be a disservice also to the archives advisors who have to go out and educate people across the country in a standard, because I don't think that the ISAG model is necessarily as intuitive as the current structure. So I think by completely eradicating it or moving to that other model, I think that we also have to be able to bring the people that are currently using the structure that we have along with us, or we'll effectively lose them in the process.
One thing just about that, it struck me when we started using ATOM database, where you could flip between RAD and ISAG descriptions, and it seemed to me it was there that I really saw, like, the RAD area struck me as really counterintuitive. Suddenly we've got these areas that we never used previously, but because they're in the standard, they had to be on the screen. But so the publisher series area, I don't know, there's a bunch of things that it seemed to me weren't really always as intuitive. I mean, I agree in the sense that we've been using them for so long, people know what they are, but I think the fact that you can map them over as well, it's just a question of sort of changing terminology. I don't see that it would necessarily be losing people.
But I guess my argument is that many of the smaller institutions across this country aren't even on a database. They're still producing paper-based finding aids. And for them to, and I think that maybe some of the archives advisors around the table might be able to speak to this particular question, but it really is extremely challenging because conceptually, all of us have been trained to be professional archivists, but when you're dealing with a volunteer constituency, I think it's very difficult to take them through the process and then go into these conceptual models that are much more complex for them to understand than I think the original structure was.
I'd like to counter that by pointing out some of the ways in which the current standard really bounces you around, though, and I actually think makes it very difficult to follow. So if you're describing, physical description, you might get bounced down to the notes area. If you're using one of the special media chapters, then the majority of entries in there just says, oh, refer to this rule back in the general section. I think it makes it very difficult to follow in a paper-based world. If you're actually using RAD as a PDF or as an actual printout and you're creating a paper-based finding aid, you're going to spend a lot of time just flipping through the book, getting referred to other rules, and I think that there are definitely ways that we could simplify a lot of that.
And I would add to that, however it's structured, I suspect one could use the standard without even knowing the conceptual model exists. Certainly that would be my hope.
And maybe just to build on that even more, if we did do the conceptual model of ISAD, I think it's understood that we would then build, media specialties that would be sort of appendices or additions that would flesh out the concepts with real-world models.
I just also want to point out one of the things that I'm seeing here based on this question is that there is kind of a difference between the structure of the standard itself and then the structure of an archival description. And we have created the standard to sort of more or less match the structure of the archival description, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And particularly if we end up with some sort of version of this where we have a set of core defined elements and then an implementation guide that is different, those two things really can be organized differently, and we don't necessarily have to be so particular about the structure to force them to be like organized in the same way. I could see it working just fine to retain the organization of the archival description, but have a implementation guide that proceeds from the general to the specific.
Let me ask just one question, maybe a simple and dumb question, but do we want our future RAD to be a tool that is that we can use a paper version of, or should it be only digital, electronic? Like I remember LAC was working on a simplified version of RAD, which was only electronic, in which you had links within the structure to bring you to other areas. So we were talking about flipping pages, and I see that every week when I teach RAD students, flipping pages, going back to chapter 1 and stuff. So why don't we have, I don't know, I'm just saying, if we have an electronic only version of our future RAD, would that be a way of having a standard that it's more flexible, and if you need to go more into detail, you click on a link, it brings you to some more detailed media information. We have the possibilities now with programs and stuff like that. Is it something we might want to consider?
I recall using that it was a website. It was an internal, essentially procedures manual here at National Archives. Yes, to some respect. I mean, we'd certainly want to move away from sort of the hypertextual linking, which was incredibly complex to follow where you are within the structure of the document. But certainly using modern tools to navigate a document, to get further information, to dig deeper into elements within the manual would certainly be possible, more so than a printed manual.
So following up on the comment about the volunteers of the land and smaller institutions, you'd have mutiny on your hands if it was online only. Early on, there was some experimentation with an XML version of RAD, but we have much better tools now to create a document that, with style sheets or whatever, you create a printable version, but it's also usable online. So to make a decision saying this has to be used online only is going to be quite restrictive, but it will also make it easier to maintain if there's a central source document.
I think that when RAD was first rolled out, there was maybe 30% of the archival community had any understanding of what AACR2 was. There were train the trainers workshops. People on the planning committee went back and forth across the country. Archives advisors eventually picked up and ran workshops. And there was a great incentive because CCA also made it a condition of getting a backlog reduction grant that you prepared your descriptions according to RAD. So I guess I would just say that this is the need for education and training in whatever follows RAD. But it is quite possible. I think that and I don't know exactly all of the reasons why RAD 2 was not a success. But it seemed to me that in the comments that were coming back, it was that the institutions felt that there had already been so much investment in RAD that they didn't want to change it. And I'm not sure that it's going to be difficult, and people are used to a certain way of doing things, and you have the added issue of you're relying on volunteers to do some of this work. But I don't think it should be an impediment. That in itself is a reason not to move forward and make a change. If that's the only impediment, is that it will be difficult, and it will be it requires a big investment of time and energy, because the first one did as well.
I just wonder if someone from CCAD, Richard, I think you prepared the analysis of the survey. Can you comment on sort of the responses that didn't map? Like, is there more that we should be digging into this?
Yeah, because the survey was just basically discussion questions, we got textual responses back. So it was a bit, to read hard percentages here is a bit arbitrary because it was basically going through and saying, okay, as we're reading through the responses, could see certain standard kind of answers emerging. So that's what's represented here. But it's a lot of times people had very nuanced discussions that don't fit into one or the other. They might have given pros and cons on something. So I'd say not mapped, or maybe they just didn't have an opinion. So that's why, if we really wanted to have, I think, something like this, we'd need to have a survey that gave people options plus a free text field, right? But we didn't do that to begin with.
Is that something that's on the table for, like, I'm just thinking about particularly these questions where it was difficult to map. I mean, I think you did a great job. I mean, I really appreciate this document because it gives us a lot to talk about. But now we're getting into these questions where mapping was difficult, and particularly this issue of the structure. Perhaps there's a need for more consultation in a way that we can get more quantifiable data.
I think for sure we could do it, especially on the basis of the answers we got. We could identify, here are the most common options, and try to get some quantified data that's not just trying to guess. Yeah.
Sorry. You want to go first?
Go for it.
I was just saying there's pretty big, it's pretty clear support, I think, in the numbers in the survey that the media chapters on AACR2 are not that widely loved, right? Like 20, what is that? No on, or the organized by area of description and element, that's a pretty, I guess there's quite a lot of not mapped, I guess that, but still 51 and 47, that's pretty. And 43, well, if you put the two discontinue and follow ISAG are both. But certainly a lot easier to teach ISAG than it is to teach RAD. And students who I teach RAD and ISAG to often just look at me and say, why is this one so much easier, right? And the flipping back and forth is a huge issue. The lack of a hyperlinked document is a huge issue. The fact that we're using based on AACR2, we have a lot of dual students in our program, and they're like scratching their heads because they don't use AACR2 anymore. So I think, in the thought of teaching, I think it's teachable, and I think you can find ways to teach it, but it's not. I don't think going to a model that is based more, say, on areas of description rather than media chapters. I don't think that will be harder to teach.
It seems to me that we started talking about the way we want to actually structure the standard, and then we also switched a little bit to talking about how we want to structure, or what format do we want to circulate information in, and so on. And I think we need to think differently about the standard and the implementation guidance. I think that this question of implementation guidance is incredibly important. The standard joke about standards that, there's so many of them and basically you can do whatever you want. It's true, right? That's standards. It's all about implementation. And I think when we're thinking about the implementation guidance, which, when you look at the media chapters, I tend to think of them more as implementation guidance necessarily than part of the standard. But, how do we want to structure and present that? I think we need to be thinking all the time about maintenance and how are we going to maintain this network of things, right? The standard, the network of crosswalks and so on that explain how it relates to other standards, and then also this implementation guidance. And the idea of moving to a publication model that's not based on digital just makes absolutely no sense to me because of the difficulties of updating analog information. And even moving to a model, for instance, based around PDF makes no sense to me because you want to be able to update this easily. I would even think that sections of the implementation guidance could probably best be handled as a wiki, in which people can just go and make the changes right away so that you actually have a more responsive document. But certainly, in terms of people finding the information, I mean, if you can create a variety of indexing tools so if people really want that old RAD structure, create an old RAD structure that you click on, note whatever, and it takes you to the equivalent field in the new, whatever this descriptive standard is that we're creating is, and provides that guidance there. It just seems to me like it's in the digital environment, we do have a lot more flexibility in terms of how we want to present the information versus how does it actually live and how is it maintained. And I would I would hope that we wouldn't go with a sort of print-oriented model. People may decide they want to print it out and have it as a paper copy for them to refer to on their desk. That's fine. But we should be able to update, or not we, whoever is responsible for the maintenance of the standard should be able to update it in a cost-effective and easy way.
So just to lay the format of the standard question to rest, I think this is something that there are enough options out there that we can make this decision at a later point. One example of a possibility, which we have begun using at Artifactual, is Sphinx documentation, and it's a markdown language which in its raw form is readable, but it allows you to generate a PDF, HTML version, as well as like a dozen other versions from that single implementation. So I think that kind of thing is something that we can probably decide later, how we maintain the standard, what its raw form is, and then be able to generate multiple versions from it.
I think it might be important to keep in mind too that we're not just arranging for a structure of the description standard, but if we want to talk about standards for arrangement and acquisition and accessioning and everything else, it's helpful to have these abstract concepts as the structure in an ISAD manner to make it more easy. For example, the work we've been doing with the accession standards, we've actually modeled it on ISAD, taking a presumptuous approach, but it's very clear that it would be very useful to have that kind of approach if you're going to go across the various archival functions and try to make interconnected standards.
Yeah, and I also go with the digital version, even though I use the paper version, even though I'm a digital person. You can print your own copy out, and most people can do that today. And also, the other thing I'd like to add is that whatever version, particularly in the digital version, I'd like it so that it's accessible for people with disabilities. So in a EPUB 3 format would be great, because that's fairly accessible, and just any document that we use to make it accessible.
Okay, I will try to make it understandable. Sorry, not sure my English speaking is pretty good. I just want to make the difference. French writer Boileau said, ce qui est bien conçu est bien énoncé. My personal translation, the way you thinking, you build it and you say it. And this is not only a question, I think, of the way you will, in a digital or in a paper mode, you will disseminate it. The tool is the way that the creations of the document you are describing is made. And I think that we are in a society that analogic is a system of you build up and you describe an analogic system in a way. And element is another way of granularity system that you need to have another way to describe an electronic or a digital document. The problem is that we are living in a world that I'm not sure, and I'm pretty sure, in fact, that we will keep both analogics and digital productions in our world. So a main issue of the descriptive standard, in my point of view, is how, and I don't have the answer, but how we can conceive models of descriptive in which you can adapt or harmonize analogic and digital way of build the creation of the records itself. And I think that it's maybe the one of the most important issue we have to keep in mind, because of course digital writing and production of records will evaluate, and probably also functions of analogic bodies of document will evaluate, but itself in their structures they will keep in two cultural way of thinking. How we can now énoncer clairement ce qui aura été bien conçu.
I wanted to add to that. I know we've got another question later on about digital materials, but in my institution, we're years away from a TDR. We're mostly an untrusted digital repository at the present time, which is in essence our records management system that we use to capture, and it's an EDMS, so it has the documents right in the system. What I actually need from the perspective of a descriptive standard is actually to create contextual descriptions in my archival database that don't have anything to do with records, but that I can link to the electronic records in a completely separate database or I can link back from them to the description of their context and the description of their creators within my archival system. And that may be a particular challenge for my institution. That may be normal for other institutions, I don't know. But I think the flexibility of the system to respond to current thinking in our descriptive standards writ large, that we ought to have a standard that can address, as you say, particular issues around analog versus digital. I didn't mean to stop the conversation.
Well, in theory, I'm here to try to make it move along. So let me ask another question regarding the structure of the standard. Do we want a standard which is similar to what we have now, meaning a first section on description and a second section on the presentation of names of entities, physical persons, and families? Or do we want to have something similar to IZAG, where you have one standard for description per se, and another distinct, but which could be linked, another distinct standard for personal names and family names and corporate names like ISAR, CPF? What do you think?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, one thing we didn't ask about in this survey was how people saw the value of Part 2. And I have to say, for me, I'd be happy to sort of jettison it in its current form, because I think even comparing like ISAR being a standard for describing bodies as opposed to forming names, it almost strikes me that kind of level of detail we get in RAD is something that we could hive off as another sort of separate document that could be handled by, again, because that's something that I think really is shared between libraries, museums, sort of Canadian authorities, how we form the names. So, yeah, that would just be my take on it.
So you're saying we would use ISAR, or?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought that through, but I mean, maybe would that be part of if we had this sort of narrowed down core elements, would we need sort of two, one for the description of creators, one for the description of records? Maybe that would be a good thing, and we could model that on the ISAR standard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's better than thinking about library and Canadian authorities, because that's having the authority control is quite, or the directory is quite different than the rules. And as I mean, part 2 obviously has some fairly specific stuff for archival material that you're never going to get in terms of published material. So there's a need for guidance on how to apply authorities for archival material, which you're not going to get in the standard library material.
There's also components in what you're saying around almost a style guide for how to describe entities that go beyond the correct formation of the name, which is critical to the authority control component. There's almost a need for a 4th section dealing with some of the broader issues around the record-keeping systems that have led to the creation of records. And again, I'm thinking particularly for my institution, as a municipality, as a government institution, there are a number, I'll say this mildly, a number of thorny issues around how one accurately describes record creation systems over time and documents those effectively, and whether that is a tool or as a separate standard that would provide guidance on creating consistent descriptions of record-keeping systems that would allow our users to understand the records themselves, the creators of records, in a consistent, described manner, as well as the record-keeping systems that they used to manage their records over time.
I agree with the idea of hiving off the description, the part 2 of RAD, the authority file, partly because it matches the workflow. When I'm describing records, I will research the creator and the context behind the creation of the records and write that as something different than the description of the records themselves. And also with the developments and things like EAC and linked open data, there's a case we made for having really strong, robust authority files that stand on their own and can be linked across repositories. However, you have to keep in mind that Article 4 of the fundamental principles of RAD is that the description of the creators is part of the record's description. It can't be lost, even if it's set aside.
I wonder, I'm just thinking about is what I also am inclined to agree about sort of removing or hiving off, as has been said. We do our authority and our archival description, our description of authority records differently. I mean, particularly since the adoption of our ADAM catalog. I mean, we have a template that we have to use, and it's based on ISAR CPF. So it almost seems like if we're talking about a national implementation of ISAD-G, do we also need to have this conversation about a national implementation of ISAR CPF? And I think where that would be most valuable would be guidance on the authority control and creating the name, basically, formatting of the heading itself. Because the rest of what you find in ISAR CPF is quite fine, and truthfully, what we have noticed when we migrated our EAD into the ADAM system is that your authority record, your administrative history or biographical sketch just gets dumped in the history portion of the ISAR record, where you can decide to flesh it out if you want or not. And we haven't really done that because we don't really know what's going to happen with that. And I'm personally someone who doesn't see a lot of value in granularity unless you're doing something with it. And since we're not developing systems where we search on the geographic location of an authority term, you know, I don't see why we need to have it sort of distinguished in any kind of way. So, nevertheless, I mean, ISAR CPF exists, and I think it's quite good, except that it doesn't provide that kind of guidance on authority control. That it does say use this create the name in accordance with national and local standards, which don't. I mean, they exist, I guess, but we don't do it that way.
Well, and don't forget, it's not just the formation of the name, but the selection of the access points. And that's where there may be more national flavor. And of course, there's many access points we've never really used, or you struggle to get them in the system. The name of a person holding an office and so on tends to get mapped to a broader term.
And don't forget as well, in terms of geographical names are used in the establishment of governance bodies. So in my institution, we use the geographical chapter to establish the formal names of municipalities which apply to geographical areas.
Right, and that's a great point. I was just referring to one example of a field in ISAR CPF that, in RAD, when you describe an authority, when you describe a person or corporate body, it does provide guidance on including information about the geographic scope, but it gets grouped into a single description. And ISAR CPF delineates all of those. And yes, downstream that could be useful, but right now, it hasn't proven to be useful to the community in the sense that we're not, people aren't coming to us to ask for a way to search for the jurisdictional scope of names in our authority file, where they may come to us and ask for guidance on searching for date ranges of archival records. So until we have a need for mining that granularity, I've been perfectly happy with how our biographical descriptions and authority records were sort of pushed into the history portion of the ISAR record. You can't automate the correct delineation anyway, so it's a fine solution, and we have continued to create new records with ISAR CPF and just adopt what happened as a result of our data migration.
I think generally speaking, management of authority records is a really important area that we should be thinking about. I'm not sure how to fit it into this discussion. I agree that part 2 of RAD there is a kind of disjuncture between the archival description and then the rules for how do you formulate an authority. I think authority records are incredibly important within the Canadian archival system, right? So, if we want to have these databases that allow access to multiple repositories, and we want to talk about, the conceptual font versus the physical records that a institution holds, this is the way to do it. And if we want to talk about some kind of a institutional convergence that actually respects the different aspects of the work of museums versus libraries versus archives, then I think authority records are kind of key. But we need to make sure that we're actually on the same page. So understanding what standards are out there, what resources are available to help with the formulation of authority files could be incredibly important and could actually lead to ways of accessing various databases that don't flatten everything out to be as though objects are the same as records are the same as record series are the same as books. So I think it's an area that we would have to think about further. And I think at this point we could say that it's one of these areas that is incredibly important and relevant to archival description, but maybe it's not the exact area that we need to have written into the standard.
I wonder if it's one of the implementation guidelines that you were referring to earlier. Because in some ways for ISAR, now I'm going to have to try to remember, that in ISAR, it's the difference between Part 2 of RAD being really about headings management, apart from choice of access points, Chapter 21, and ISAR, which has as one of its components headings management, but it's more context management, and then that's how it connects to the functions, and right, it's growing. So it's one dimension of context management now. And I think that it may be something where it seems to me Part 2 is a perfect example of the kind of implementation guidelines you're talking about. When those rules were developed, there was very little change made from the Anglo-American cataloging rules. There were a couple of things that had to do with when the name of the creator changes and a few other examples, but it's almost identical to the AACR2 standard. I don't know, for those people who have been involved in the development of the networks, the descriptive lists, what do you use in, for example, in Archaeon? Have these networks been using Part 2 of RAD? for headings management within those systems?
Maybe. So just to speak to what everyone's been talking about, one of the practical pressure points that we hit with when we started working with Adam and suddenly all these authority records were surfaced is that we found that institutions would have similar but overlapping descriptions that the authority records relates directly to their records. And how do we allow for that versioning where we have the authority record with all the various iterations of the name, all of the authorities attached to that entity, but also give precedence to the most appropriate institution's description. So if you're searching Victoria College's archives for now I can't remember his name. Anyways, Northrop Frye. The way Victoria College and the University of Toronto describes Northrop Frye is going to be completely different from another local institution. So the idea of that a person has various iterations and the reflection, how that individual is reflected through the records. So I agree that part 2 doesn't, it served a purpose, but there's other projects that are happening in other institutions in other ways where the archival voice is not as strong as it could be. And I feel like there's enthusiasm for authority record development where we could sort of hive that off, have that little group of really excited people to work on these kinds of things. Because I don't think they are using them up to a point, but then every institution, the way they describe their authorities is going to be slightly different. We just need the structure that's going to pull all those threads together into that one. This is the stable URL that represents this individual or this entity or this municipality. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, we can all follow part 2 perfectly correctly and down to the letter, and we'll still create different authority headings. So the maintenance is a separate issue, as you say.
Just a quick comment. It almost strikes me that all of part 2 is almost like a commentary on one in ISAR, the name element. Like, here's a sort of content standard for how you form a name, but it doesn't really address all those other issues around what elements should make up the authority record. And I think like that issue of shared authority records is a huge one because we've hit it in our own institution where we're both having a shared authority record. How do we do that? It would be nice if you could have multiple histories, I think, attached to one authority record, but it recognizes an authority record. But I guess I just think RAD is not really addressing that. It's just strictly, here's how you have a name of Baron so-and-so from Hungary. Here's how you have, like that level of detail seems to me we've got it done now. It is like one of these sort of implementation guidelines that's there.
The thing I see, though, is if you are using Adam and you have to create an ISAR CPF, you have to, when you go, there's no administrative history or biographical sketch anymore. So if we're going to redo RAD, we have to redo something that maps onto that as well, which I think, my understanding of it is that basically ISAR CPF, the administrative history and biographical sketch is taken from RAD. It's completely influenced by RAD. So I think, if we're talking about doing a national implementation of ISAG, we have to do a national implementation of ISAR CPF too. We can't just say, here's what we're going to do with the records, but then we'll, so I think, and with more and more people using Adam, if you are, you're directed right into creating the ISAR CPF records, I think we should also have a national implementation of that too, and then these kinds of issues can be thought through as well, right? I don't think we can hive off the because if we're, I get concerned about hiving off the description of creators too much, which is, we can separate description of records and description of creators, but as a group that is talking about the future of RAD, we can't say, whatever, creators, we'll deal with you later, right? It's not, it's maybe dealing with the two. Maybe one of the problems is that RAD Part 2 hasn't had enough attention, right? It hasn't been glorified to the extent it should be. Not as it is necessarily now, but it may be not a question of separating the two, but bringing them together in a different way and doing more with Part 2, right? And I think, RAD 2 is not perfect, but RAD 2 does more of that, right? So I just think I think we can't say, oh, we'll just use ISAR CPF again. See, I'm going to always come back to this, is that those are international standards meant to have a national implementation.
I would totally agree with what you're saying, but I would also say that the question of the wording of the heading is incredibly important, because it's the formulation of the name is going to be what enables the access. But at the same time, I like what you were saying about the fact that you're going to have different content for the actual record about the creators coming from different systems, and obviously we need to preserve that. But from what our users want to get out of this, I think, being able to coordinate all that, I don't even know what it would look like in the end if you had multiple sort of creator histories. How would you present that in a way? That's a secondary question that, first you have to be able to see that they're all the same creator. And I think that through authority control, through heading management and so on.
And you have to have a clear way of indicating, like if you have a very small portion of the papers of someone or the records of someone, and you have a enormously full biographical sketch, you have to have some very clear way of indicating, this person did all these things, but you're not going to find most of it here, right? You're going to find this part of it. So I think... Yeah.
I think that's typically achieved with the scope and content note. I mean, I think that preserving multiple descriptions of creators would be a huge disservice to the end user. I don't see any reason why we need to think about the description of entities in the same way that we need to think about the description of records. The records are unique to the institutions that are creating the descriptions. The people that create those records are not. And so we've run into this situation with Memory NS, multiple authority records, and whose description do you take? And I think it's a bit of a red herring. I mean, you have to make some decisions, you have to merge them together, and you have to have a single description of the authority. That's the intention behind all of the standardization of describing authorities. And I see the adoption of ISAR CPF as something very different than the adoption of ISAD-G. I mean, we have, in a sense, de facto adopted, ISAR CPF is not the de facto standard for creating authorities in Canada, because virtually every province and territory is using the same descriptive software that implements ISAR CPF in a perfectly elegant way, except that we have this issue of duplicate authority headings. So I think the issue really is more about the formulation of the heading itself and the access points and whatnot, but there's really only one person that creates their font, and if you have this problem of, well, every institution kind of describes that person in relation to their records, well, that's not really what was intended, I don't think, and there are other elements of the archival description that contextualize the creator in relation to the records, and maybe what we need is a more fulsome explanation of how to use a scope and content note, for instance, to reflect on the creation of the records, or maybe we need more description of the creation of the material that's being described. But I really think that we should be working on a national or an international authority. I mean, like that's the direction of EAC and SNAC and ISAR is to create. VIAF is being pulled into this. There's already a huge amount of work gone into that, and for us to say, well, we're going to try to preserve some way for institutions to all describe the same people in different ways would be a huge shortcoming of our work here, I think. Yeah.
I think it's also important to recognize the evolution of RAD with respect to the library standards, because and I'll come back to my point about needing some kind of a style guide to speak to what you're talking about. There's actually a distinction in bibliographic cataloging between scope and content, but very few descriptions that I've seen actually tease out that distinction between those two elements. And I think having a tool, whether it's an implementation guide, whether it's a style guide, that educates our users or archivists on how to properly and fulsomely use descriptions to tease out the idiosyncratic nature or the institutional specific nature of our descriptions. Yeah.
Well, I didn't think we would go off that route when I mentioned authority control. We've pretty much reached the end, or even went a little bit beyond what was scheduled for that session. Just to go back on some topics that were mentioned. Well, first, an electronic-only version of RAD would be kind of neat, but really too limiting, including some smaller archives which rely heavily upon volunteers. So the paper version is still something that we have to keep in mind, which is still relevant. I also mainly use the paper version anyways during my daily work, so yeah, paper for sure. But a point was made about a new standard, whatever it might be, that training is something that would have to be on the top of our list in terms of what we have to do regarding that standard. And we mentioned it a few minutes ago, but an implémentation, un guide d'implémentation would be required also, which would be taught along with the standard itself basically onto how apply the standard. We talked about maintenance, keeping crosswalks up to date, and also to have a standard which takes into account both digital and analog documents and retain proper information about the context of their creation. And, well, we finished off with ISAR and other, the second part of RAD regarding creators and how it probably should be kept separate and should be another standard we use along with a standard we choose. But basically the fact that authority records are very, very important. So I think that's it, unless someone has something to add about. Okay.